So we're going to hear from Dr. Jordan Casey, who's a professor at UT's Marine Science Institute, about how will coral reefs survive global change. I'll tell you a little bit about Jordan. She was born and raised coastal South Carolina on a small island off the coast of Charleston. And on this island, there was a salt marsh, and she lived right near there. And she would just go hiking and exploring and developed a real love of nature and knew whatever it was she was going to do with her life, it was going to be something about understanding how nature worked. And so she would bring home snakes to her mom, who somehow wasn't as pleased as she thought she would be when she'd deliver these snakes or bones from a raccoon that she found or whatever it was. And so she went on then to the University of the South to study ecology and Spanish as an undergraduate. And another thing that Casey knew from a young age, not only was she always going to explore and study and understand nature, but she was always going to see a big part of the world. So for her PhD, she went to the other side of the planet to James Cook University in Australia, and that's where she became an expert on coral reefs. She did postdoctoral research at the Smithsonian and also in France, and came to UT in 2021. And what she studies is how critters in ocean ecosystems interact with each other. She does this using molecular methods to study food webs and how the strength or the weakness of these food webs that she could gain a unique understanding through these really cool methods she uses, how that bears on whether or not these ecosystems, these coral reefs, how resilient they will be in the face of global change. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Jordan Casey, who's a scientist, a new mom, and a spearfisher. Please welcome Jordan Casey.
Thank you, Jay, for that wonderful introduction. So step into my office. This is a coral reef in the Maldives. And as you can see, there are beautiful fishes, there are vibrant colors. It's a really magical place. And as a coral reef scientist, I spend a lot of time scuba diving and studying what's underwater. And I get to spend time in a lot of really beautiful places, like this island. This is Lizard Island in Australia, where I did my PhD work. And I've been really lucky to have conducted research all over the world. And you can see this red band. This shows the tropics, all of the hot places, and that's where a lot of our tropical coral reefs are. And this is a coral reef. You can see immediately there's lots of movement happening. And primarily what these fishes are doing is they're trying to avoid being eaten, and they're trying to find food. These things are constantly eating underwater. This one in particular is from Fiji. So I want you to take a moment and think about food and what it means to you. So personally, I get food in a lot of different ways. I really like to garden. So I have a garden in my backyard, as I'm sure some of y'all do. This is my prized watermelon from a couple years ago. When I lived in France, I loved to go foraging for mushrooms. And I love spearfishing. This is a trevally that I caught in French Polynesia. But at the end of the day, most of my food comes from the H-E-B. Does everyone have a favorite grocery store that you go to? H-E-B? Yeah, I like H-E-B. It's great. But have you ever seen your H-E-B look like this? Maybe during the peak of COVID or during one of the freeze events, the supply chain gets interrupted and the food is gone. The shelves are empty. In my local H-E-B in South Texas, it was almost empty except for a box of parsnips. So clearly South Texans hate parsnips and don't know what to do with them. I love them. I ate it for about a week. But people still lined up outside of the H-E-B because they knew one day they were going to walk in and the shelves would be restocked. They would have food again. On coral reefs, the shelves don't get restocked overnight. So I want you to keep that in mind. What does food mean to you? And what does food mean to animals underwater? So this is an outline of my talk today. I'm going to share a little bit about my research, and then I'm going to tell you about the future of coral reefs. So there are 6 different chapters. Let's get started with the first. What creatures live on coral reefs? So what creatures do you think about when you think about coral reefs? Fish, great. Shark? Good. Great answers. A lot of people think of these vibrant coral reef fishes, bright blue, bright yellows. Also megafauna, maybe humpback whales, sharks, tarpon, sea turtles. All good answers you already had guessed, right? Also some friendly dolphins. But most creatures on coral reefs are not big megafauna. They're little things. So a lot of the things that I study look like this. Can you see anything? Yeah, there's a fish right there. That's called a triple fin. It's less than an inch long. It's about 2 centimeters. And it lives on the bottom of a coral reef, and it's really well camouflaged in the bottom. And it's considered to be a cryptic critter. What is that? It's an often overlooked critter because it's tiny and or it's well camouflaged. It blends in on the bottom of the reef. And there are lots of them on coral reefs. This is a tiny crab on the tip of my finger. This is called a skeleton shrimp. It's actually not a shrimp. It's an amphipod. And this is what it looks like in the real world. Can you see it? It's right there. It blends in almost completely. And it kind of behaves like these giant inflatable men that you see at car dealerships. This is called a flathead. And it lives its entire life buried underneath the sand with only its eyes poking out. And even the eyes are covered with these skin flaps that help it camouflage. This is a cute little starfish. It has these imbricated plates that look like little hearts. And this, as you can hear, is a snapping shrimp. It's one of the main things that you hear when you go diving on coral reefs. They do something called producing little bubbles with their claws, and this is what creates the noise that you hear. So there are thousands of cryptic creatures on coral reefs, but most of them remain undescribed. We don't know in science what most of them are. There's a lot of work we need to do. So how is there so much diversity on coral reefs? Well, they only cover 0.1% of our seafloor, and yet 25 to 40% of all the diversity live there. And it's been estimated that coral reefs are home to 830,000 species worldwide. That's a massive number of species. And one group of fishes that I'm really interested in studying are cryptobenthic reef fishes. So they're those cryptic critters, but they're fishes. They have extremely short life cycles. They live for less than 1 year. They have very small body sizes, generally less than 1 inch big. And they have limited adult dispersal, meaning that they only leave their homes like 1 to 2 miles max, their entire lives. Now, this shows the number of reef fishes that have been described by science to date. So currently, from 1750 to present day, about 3,495 species of large fishes have been described. How many species of cryptobenthic fishes do you think have been described by science?
100.
100. Good guess.
Either somewhere less than 1,000 or more than 10,000.
Okay, that's a great guess. You got it right. 2,780, and these are rapidly increasing thanks to the advent of scuba diving and the use of DNA to describe these species. And one of the reasons why they lagged behind the big fishes is because they're really hard to find. So we really had to spend a lot more time underwater, and there's probably a lot more work to do. Now I want to take you to the Caribbean to tell you about a particular cryptobenthic fish that I became really interested in. It's called the tusked goby, and it's distributed all the way from Florida down to Brazil. And it has these crazy teeth that stick out. It really should go to the orthodontist, I think. But scientists have actually hypothesized that these fishes use the teeth to hang on inside of sponges. And that's because this species spends its entire life inside of a sponge. And as I was collecting cryptobenthic fishes around the Caribbean, I started to realize that these fishes were everywhere, and in some regions, they tended to prefer certain sponges. So I thought maybe speciation was happening. That's the evolution of a new species to the genetic divergence of populations. So I decided I was going to go and collect these fishes all over the Caribbean. So I went all over the place, and we collected using scuba collections and also using a deep sea submersible. Has anyone heard of a deep sea submersible for science? Yeah? Pro tip, if you go in a deep sea submersible, don't drink a lot of liquids because you're underwater for about 6 to 8 hours and there's no privacy and no bathrooms. So after collecting all of these test gobies, we discovered that there were actually 7 distinct genetic lineages of this goby. So what we thought was one species is actually probably 7 different species. And interestingly, we found that the gobies were really specialized in certain sponges. So if you look at the left, these are the different goby lineages, and we found that 2 of them only live inside certain sponges. So sponge host specialization allowed them to diversify, to speciate. Now, why does this even matter? So there are bigger fishes underwater, like this hawkfish here, or this wrasse, that eat all of these cryptic fishes. And we need to understand how many species are down there to understand how the food web is put together. These cryptic species really form the base of a food web. So what is a food web anyway? It's a network of feeding relationships, and it demonstrates who eats whom underwater. And what does that look like? Well, this is a simple food web, and here parrotfishes and damselfishes eat algae and coral. And then the bigger fishes, the sharks and your groupers, eat your damselfishes and your parrotfishes. And finally, your sharks eat your grouper. And together, this is a very basic picture of how a coral reef food web works, but it's much more complex than this. And I started realizing that these things were a lot more complex than we had originally thought. So I wanted to study this a bit more deeply. So how do coral reef species interact? Can anyone tell what these fishes are eating? These are trevally and groupers. It looks like they're eating an anemone, but they're eating something under the anemone. To be honest, I watched these fish for 20 minutes and I couldn't figure it out. I had no idea. Probably some invertebrate underneath the anemone. These fishes also are a bit sneaky. Although I know they're herbivores and they're probably feeding on algae, you're going to need a microscope underwater to identify what kind of algae they're feeding on. It's really hard to ID. So one way we can understand what fishes are eating is we collect them and we dissect out their intestines and we look inside their stomachs. And sometimes it's really clear. You can look inside and you see, does anyone know what that is? Octopus, yeah? There's an eel, there's a little crab claw, or maybe they have beautiful crabs inside their stomachs. Other times you look inside, it's not so clear. What is this? Honestly, I'm not sure. This is what comes out of a parrotfish gut. Can you tell what that is? Probably some kind of algae, but good luck IDing that. It's just sludge. And this is where DNA comes in. So DNA is the barcode of an organism. So if you walk into the grocery store and you buy a carton of milk, it has a little barcode on the side. And that barcode specifically codes for only that carton of milk. In the same way, DNA is the barcode for a specific organism. It's distinct to that species. So this could be the DNA sequence that codes for instance, this little crab. And the way barcoding works is that you take a little snip from an organism, like this arm of this octopus, and you perform a DNA extraction, where you separate the DNA from the tissue of an animal, and then you sequence, you decode that DNA to then put a taxonomic identification and name the species of that organism. And you can do this on a metascale, so you can do this across many species. And to do that, you take an environmental sample, so that can be a water sample, a sediment sample, or the gut contents from a fish, and you can do a mass amplification of DNA barcodes to assign taxonomic IDs to a multitude of organisms. So I want to tell you about how I use gut content metabarcoding to put together food webs in Moorea in French Polynesia. So my first food web, I decided to look at just 22 species of fishes. So all the fishes are on the top and all the things that they ate on the bottom. And this might look really complex, but it's actually a really simplified food web. We found over 4,341 prey items inside these fishes' stomachs, thanks to the power of DNA. But 22 fish species is not a whole coral reef. There are many, many more species. So I wanted to collect an entire food web to understand how the entire structure looked. So I went out and I collected large reef fishes using spearfishing, which is a lot of fun. Any spearfishers out here? Maybe? Anyone? Yay, we got one back there, great. A lot of people always ask, aren't you afraid of sharks when you're spearfishing? Because you have a bag of dead fish usually with you. And not really, because sharks are pretty predictable. What I am afraid of are moray eels. So we often put our catch bags at the bottom of the reef to make sure the sharks don't become interested in what we're catching. And sometimes the morays come out of the reef matrix and have a little snack with our bags. And I do not fight them because in Moorea they are huge. They're like 8 feet long with heads the sizes of soccer balls. So we just let them have it. But the morays aren't so interested in the cryptobenthic fishes. So those are the ones that are just about an inch big. So we collected those using an anesthetic called clove oil. And if you're a member of an older generation, you might remember clove oil from the dentist. So they used to rub it on people's gums, and it's a numbing agent. So in the same way, it numbs the fishes because they're covered in mucus. So after we collected the fishes, the less glamorous side of things happened. We dissect them in the lab. It's a lot stinkier too. And ultimately, we put together a really big food web. We collected over 2,000 or almost 2,000 fish species, and we identified, thanks to DNA, 50,000 prey items. And as far as we're aware, this is the highest resolution food web that's ever been constructed for a coral reef ecosystem. So we're really excited about that. So, what is so special about what we found? Well, all the fish groups that we collected are on the left of that graph, and on the bottom represents the uniqueness of their diet. 0 means their diets completely overlap, and 1 means they're completely unique. So the average uniqueness within these fish groups was 80%. So 80% of the dietary items of closely related fish species are unique. And that means that every fish is special in what they're eating. And in other terms, let's focus on the surgeonfishes. These are vegetarians, and we looked at 18 species of surgeonfishes. So imagine 18 vegetarians go to the grocery store. 70% of what they buy is completely different. So these fishes have really unique diets. This is a beautiful surgeonfish going to the grocery store, eating some algae. What happens when we lose that fish? What happens to a coral reef food web? Well, let's take a look at our simple food web with just 22 fish species again. What happens when we remove one? Okay, there are some linkages that went missing. What if we take away all the wrasses? Well, there's a big chunk missing now in the middle. What if we took away all the wrasses in the butterfly fishes? Well, there's a huge chunk. The structure of that web has completely changed. It's like Jenga. When you start pulling out blocks and different linkages, things can fall apart really quickly and maybe even collapse. And we decided to look at food webs around the globe. So we looked at all different locations, and we found striking similarities with these food webs, where these fishes have really narrow dietary preferences. So they have really unique diets. And when we started taking away consumer species, the food web started collapsing very quickly. So the structure is really important, and every species matters. Every single fish species has a unique special role, from the really little things like this pipefish to the bigger animals like this angelfish. So how does global change impact coral reefs? So what is a coral anyway? We have to start here to understand how it impacts coral reefs. They're not rocks and they're not algae, even though they might look like it. They're actually living animals. And all of those little circles, for instance, on the top left photo, all those little green circles are individual polyps, individual animals. And they form a colony, all living together. And inside of these polyps live zooxanthellae, which are little microalgae that produce energy for the corals. And they also give their corals their color. And corals are really sensitive to temperature. So as you all know, the global average sea surface temperature has been rising. It's gone up about 2 degrees since pre-industrial times. In 2024 was the warmest year on record to date. And this is a problem for corals because when they experience marine heat waves, which are prolonged periods of warming, of high sea surface temperature, they undergo coral bleaching. So what is that? So on the left, you see a healthy coral with the zooxanthellae inside the polyps. In the middle, the coral becomes really stressed and the polyps spit out their microalgae and they turn bleach white. Then on the right, this is a coral that's experienced an extensive marine heat wave and it dies and it becomes covered in algae. So we recently observed a coral bleaching event in Moorea in French Polynesia. So this is a healthy coral reef before the bleaching event. And this is the coral reef during a bleaching event. You can see the corals are bleached white. It's very widespread and it was quite extensive. Oops. And it was a very long bleaching event as well. It lasted several months. So that resulted in the mortality of a lot of corals, and they became covered in algae. So overall, there have been 4 global coral bleaching events. And on the right here, you can see the percent of bleached corals in each of these events. It's a little hard to see, but the gray represents all the continents, and the colored areas are our oceans. So the darker the color, the greater the extremity of the heat. And as you can see, these bleaching events have become more extreme over time, with a higher percentage of the corals experiencing bleaching and mortality afterwards. So just recently, in 2023 to 2024, was our most recent coral bleaching event. And in my lab alone, we saw bleaching in 3 different locations: Belize, Panama, and Florida. And you can see the extensiveness of this bleaching and this heat going through the Gulf of Mexico and throughout the Caribbean. So what does this mean for the fishes? We decided to study butterfly fishes, which almost exclusively feed on corals. So they must be really impacted, right? So I studied the ornate butterfly fish and the reticulated butterfly fish. So we know corals and butterfly fishes are innately linked very closely. So we looked over 2 decades of data and we saw how they were so linked over time. So in the orange, these are the corals, and in the purple are the coral feeding fishes. And after several disturbance events, like crown of thorns outbreaks, these are starfishes that eat corals, as well as a cyclone, and then that coral bleaching event in 2019, you can see that the coral feeding fishes decline along with the corals. So they have a very tightly linked response. Now, after the bleaching event, we monitored the population of these butterfly fishes, and we found that there was a 40% mortality in coral, and this corresponded with a 50% population decline in butterfly fishes. So in just 1 year, 50% of butterfly fishes died. We also examined their diets with gut content metabarcoding, and we looked at their ability to absorb nutrients. And we found that they do not shift their diets. They can only eat corals. They have no other choice. And they had difficulty digesting nutrients from these stressed corals. So recurrent bleaching events may really jeopardize the survival of these coral reef fishes over time. So this is a little butterfly fish. They have territories. So they kind of map out their favorite corals to feed on. You can see him kind of probing in, trying to find a place to feed. But this coral is bleached and he finds no food, and eventually he swims off. So he's basically showing up at the grocery store, and his favorite foods are not in stock. There's only parsnips. And I bet butterfly fishes don't like parsnips either. So what is the future of coral reefs? So since 1950, coral reefs have already experienced some massive declines. Live coral cover has declined by 50%, and there's been a reduction in the catch of coral reef fishes by 60%. So what does this mean? What are they going to look like in the future? They could become covered in algae, and we're already starting to see this in certain locations. So algae competes with corals, and oftentimes if there's marine heat waves and other extreme events that stress out the corals, the algae can win. And you get coral reefs that look like this. This is in Bocas del Toro in Panama, and some of the reefs have already transitioned to becoming algae dominated. Some scientists also hypothesized that reefs could become dominated by sponges. So in Florida, giant barrel sponges have started to take over in certain reefs, and they can also undergo bleaching. But sponges do not rely on their symbionts to survive. So it's okay if they bleach, they can still live. And after the most recent heating event, 2023 to 2024, some of the reefs in Florida were left only dominated with surviving barrel sponges and nothing else. Nothing else survived. Reefs could also become covered in sediment, where all the biological life is eliminated. And we see this often around big cities that have a lot of other stressors. So this is a reef in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. And because of all the pollution running in from the city, it's almost devoid of all corals and all fishes. But some coral reefs are surviving, and they are doing okay. We might end up with some healthy coral reefs. So this is a coral reef in Caribou Key in Belize, and it's not perfect. It's not what it was in the 1970s, but this is elkhorn coral. This is an endangered species, and it still has stands of this coral here. Why should we even care, though? Why do we care if coral reefs survive in the future? Well, humans have an innate love for natural things. Does everyone enjoy going on hikes, spending some time outside? Yeah. But that's called biophilia, by the way. But if that doesn't convince you, there are many other reasons. There are lots of ecosystem services that coral reefs provide. For instance, they protect our coasts from big storm surge. They provide food. They provide pharmaceutical bioprospecting, meaning you could find drugs in different animals and plants on reefs, like sponges provide a lot of pharmaceuticals. They also provide opportunities for tourism and recreation. They provide educational opportunities. Also, carbon sequestration. And finally, they have spiritual value. But if that still doesn't convince you, they also have economic value. So the value of coral reefs worldwide, it's been estimated that they're worth $2.7 trillion annually. And that's primarily through fisheries, tourism, and shoreline protection. And they also serve about 1 billion people through these services. Well, if they're so valuable, we must be putting a lot of money into their research, right? What do you think? Are we? Well, our government budget, federal budget, I know this is going to be the boring part. The federal budget was $6.9 trillion. And most ecological research is funded by two federal agencies, the National Science Foundation and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. What percent of that budget do you think they awarded these agencies? What percent? 75, I wish. Wow. I like these guesses, but 0.005% of our federal budget went toward ecology, which would include all efforts for coral reef conservation. Now, what do you think? We know that coral reefs, some of our most vulnerable ecosystems, are supported by the government by 0.005% of the budget. What percent of the budget goes toward healthcare for vulnerable people? 9%. Good guesses, good guesses. 24%. So we do care about people. That's pretty good. But maybe a little less about the planet. And unfortunately, the trajectory for funding isn't so good right now. So coral reef scientists, this is us right now, or most ecologists, most scientists in general, I would say. So is there still hope for coral reefs? I would say yes. I think these are magical places. They're beautiful. I couldn't imagine our planet without them. And there are pillars of action that we can take to protect these ecosystems. We can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We can mitigate local stressors, so things like pollution. If we reduce pollution, that makes some of these coral bleaching events less severe. We can also conduct restoration to retain corals. And a notable scientist in coral reef science, Dr. Nancy Knowlton, she started the movement called ocean optimism, where she has really encouraged coral reef scientists to remain optimistic about the future of coral reefs, because we can't just lose hope. So I looked across all of the total papers over the past few decades, and actually a lot of them have positive outcomes. A lot of coral reef conservation papers have positive stories to tell. And it's about 30 to 40% say things are going pretty well, or there's some, silver lining in this story. So I want to share some of those success stories with you. So there are efforts to restore coral reefs by putting branches of corals and kind of replanting them. And in a meta-analysis, they found that there is about a 60 to 70% survival rate of these coral fragments on reefs. And all of these dots represent areas where they're implementing these efforts of coral restoration. But there is a bit of a debate within this space. So Robert Streit and others recently said, unfortunately, current and future heat waves will continue to kill these regrown corals. And Jennifer Moore from NOAA states, this is a last-ditch sort of insurance policy. If we don't address climate change, our replanted corals are just going to die again, right? The eradication of invasive rats, however, has a very, very positive message. So nutrients from islands to reefs in the presence of and absence of rats have very clear patterns. So where rats are present, there's much less nutrients. And when rats are not present, the nutrient levels are much higher. And that goes all the way from the land to the sea. So it's really clear that when invasive species are not around, coral reefs benefit. And when they eradicate these invasive rats from these islands, they found that coral reefs can become what they were. So it took about 16 years for coral reefs to become healthy again. In marine protected areas, meaning areas where local managers put in different policies to prevent overfishing, it really works. So Josh Sinner and others identified these bright spots around the world, and these are highlighted in yellow. And they found that especially in Pacific Island nations, despite not having a lot of resources, a lot of money to put into management, they have local managers that really care about their reefs because they depend on them for their livelihoods. And they do a great job managing their resources. And these reefs are overperforming. They're producing more fish biomass than would be expected. But ultimately, we need to address coral reef conservation with policy actions. And this is the difficult part, because we really have to work at an international scale. We need to establish commitment to make sure we set thresholds that address the problems at hand. We need to promote coherence. We need to work across the world and collaborate on levels and make sure everyone is fulfilling their commitment to reduce emissions, for instance. And finally, driving innovation. We need to come up with new solutions and use science to come up with new ideas to address the problems we have on coral reefs. And the time for action truly is now, if not yesterday. And I would like to say that most coral reef scientists did not go into coral reef science to study climate change. This is just the reality of the day, and I think all of us have to be part of this. Because future emission scenarios are quite grim. Even in the best case scenarios, with very low emissions, the world will change and coral reefs will change in the future. Oh. So even though I know my daughter won't know coral reefs of the 2020s, I really hope that something is going to be left for her. She's the one on the right, by the way. We can restock coral reefs. It's not going to happen overnight like our wonderful HED, but I think we can make things better if we all work together at an international level. Because from the smallest things, like this little nudibranch, to the biggest organisms, coral reefs are some of the most magical places in the world. And I hope you would agree, and I think we still have a shot. So with that, I'd like to thank all of my lab members who have really supported all of my research over the past 5 years, members past and present, wonderful group of people, and all of the collaborators that have contributed to this research, and funding agencies and universities that have supported me along the way. With that, thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Sounds great.
Thanks very much, Jordan. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer questions. So you can come into either aisle and I'll come to you with a microphone if you have questions.
So I don't know if you saw, but like some corals are starting to become like fluorescent in response to like heat. Do you think that's like a positive response to stress, or is it just another way that they're demonstrating stress? What do you think of that situation?
Yeah, so we see fluorescence at the beginning of a lot of coral bleaching events, especially with acroporids, so branching corals. It's not fully studied in science. There are some hypotheses as to why that's happening. I don't think it's better or worse. I think it's just part of the bleaching process. The unfortunate part of that is they become this beautiful, vibrant, like green or purple or pink, and when tourists go out on reefs, they're like, oh wow, what a beautiful bleaching event. And that's not great, because it's definitely not a positive thing.
You suggested that we all need to make new ideas, so is there a website or place I can give out ideas?
Wow.
That's a great question. There should be a website, and I think you should design it. So do you have some good ideas? If I have any. Well, we're looking to the future generations to come up with the new ideas. So I'm so excited to what you can do. Maybe with your classmates, you can come up with ideas to help save coral reefs.
If you do that, send it to ESI. We'll share it with Professor Casey.
Would love to see that.
Okay. Monday morning.
When a marine heat wave occurs, how much does the temperature of the water differ?
Oh wow, that is a fantastic question. So it really depends. Do you remember those heat maps I showed? That sometimes it was like an orange and sometimes it was a purple. So even if it's just 2 degrees above a normal temperature, that can stress corals out in a long enough time period that they can bleach. But sometimes these heat waves, it gets even hotter and the bleaching happens faster and they die faster. But just a few degrees and they can really suffer.
Thank you.
Hi. How does your knowledge about the food webs impact your spearfishing choices, or maybe our food choices at HEB?
Yeah, that's a great point. I debate a lot about collecting to kill and whether that's an ethical practice. I think for science, it's justifiable in a small way because we make sure that the number of individuals that we catch would not harm the total population. But I think we need to be really aware of that, especially when looking at commercially caught fishes and how that informs our consumption in supermarkets. So there are great guides, online mostly these days, that can advise you on what are the smartest seafood choices. And in Texas, for instance, oysters can be a good choice to consume if you're interested in seafood. There are sustainable harvesting practices around oysters. So definitely look into online sources, depending where you are in the world or where you're visiting, and that can be a really helpful guide to your seafood choices.
Thank you for the talk. With the rise of global sea levels, how do you think coral reefs will prevail?
Right, so that's another thing I didn't really discuss. Great point. So with corals are photosynthetic, thanks to their zooxanthellae. So with increasing depth, that might impact how coral reefs are performing overall. It also impacts the way that they protect coastlines, because if water gets higher, they're not quite right there at the coast protecting them. Yeah, so I think there could be multiple ways that's being done, but it's not necessarily my area of research. I would defer to maybe geologists a bit more than me for that. But great question.
Thanks. Have there been any studies or any efforts to look into having these organisms, corals, become more heat resistant to adapt to such conditions? Because we know that other marine life have adapted to extreme heat and even thrive in it. So anyway.
Yes, there have been. There have been multiple labs. There's a notable lab in the Red Sea led by Raquel Peixoto, for instance, that she has been experimenting with basically probiotics for corals, in which she introduces microorganisms to corals to try to develop heat resistance in different strains. And she has had some success with that. So you can introduce microorganisms, and that is a novel way to approach restoration, and I think it does have merit and it requires thought. But I think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, we have to address climate change to make sure we reduce our heat emissions, because even if we fix things in the short term, it eventually will get too hot.
Hi, could you go a little more into detail about the work you do at UTMSI?
Sure. So my research program is now split into two parts. I still conduct research on coral reefs. I think that's my first and probably lifelong passion. But I also conduct local research. I'm mostly working with oyster reefs at UTMSI locally. I do a lot of work with environmental DNA, so collecting water samples to identify biodiversity in certain areas, and looking at human impact on our local Texan ecosystems and what that means for patterns of biodiversity and the survival of oysters.
Do all coral reefs live in the same temperature water?
No, that's a great question. So there's actually a really wide gradient. There are some colder, even temperate zone coral reefs. So I think Dr. Adrienne Correa was here not so long ago. You can look at her talk. It was talk 111, I think I saw up there. So look it up online. And she researches coral reefs in the flower gardens. And that's pretty deep and pretty high latitude. So it's off the coast of Texas. So it's much cooler there than a lot of places in the tropics where I do my research. And there are places, for instance, in the reef I showed you in Abu Dhabi, so in the United Arab Emirates, the Persian or Arabian Gulf is one of the hottest areas in the world. And so it's a really great place to study extremes, because it's like a living laboratory of really, really hot temperatures where some things are surviving quite well.
How long does it usually take for coral to recover from hot weather?
To recover. So after it dies or after it bleaches initially?
After it bleaches.
After it bleaches. So if the temperatures do decrease, maybe in a few days or in a week or two, the corals can reobtain zooxanthellae from the water column. They can get their microalgae back and they can recover. And we see after most coral bleaching events, some corals do recover. But if that bleaching event lasts for a long time, usually 2 weeks or more, that's when they start dying because they can't live without their microalgae for a long period of time.
Hi, you mentioned that there's more and more research on sort of good news around, I guess, coral reefs and other places. Do you have any examples, or are there like trends that you see in that sort of growing body of research?
So a lot of that space is dedicated to coral restoration, I would say. I would gauge that a little bit based on the International Coral Reef Society and what kind of talks we see that are happening right now. And a lot of research is about restoring corals. But again, I think it's a worthy effort, but at the end of the day, we do need to address climate change to make sure that warming does not accelerate.
Jordan, I've got a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I got a little scared and a little bit of an adrenaline rush when you were describing this 8-foot-long soccer-headed moray eel, soccer ball-headed, coming at you from some cryptic environment in the reef. But you're pretty blasé about sharks. Have you had any, that gets my adrenaline going too. So have you had any encounters with sharks in all of your work?
I have had a few encounters. I think they were more curious than aggressive. Sharks have really clear body language that are pretty easy to read depending on how they hunch their backs. So they make me less nervous. And if you do see one getting aggressive, I mean, the first thing you do is just drop your bag of fish. You don't want to keep a pile of dead fish around. But generally, the sharks are curious and not in me. So.
What's their body language when they're about to take a bite out of you?
They hunch up a little bit. Yeah, they hunch up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and yeah. So.
Excellent.
Just don't touch them. You'll be fine. Yeah.
You have a question? All right.
So apart from the global warming, how about infections of, let's say, due to bacteria? How have your research tackled that, or how can that be tackled to also sustain the coral reefs?
Great. So he's asking about coral disease. So coral disease has been found to be correlated with certain events and other stressors. For instance, heat stress could trigger a spread of some infections. Like black band disease is found to be linked with bacteria on the reef. So when things get hot, more corals get disease. But it's not always so clear. A lot of coral diseases are still really mysterious, and we don't know why or when. There's a new syndrome going around that's been spreading, and it's quite scary across the Caribbean. So researchers are working really hard to determine, is this a bacteria? Is this a virus? And we are still learning. So it's not something that's necessarily being fixed. It's just something that's being monitored at the moment.
Whenever a coral bleaches and then comes back, does it come back weaker or does it come back the same?
That is a great question. Trying to think if I've heard any stories about that. So I think that often the ones that recover actually are more likely to survive the second go around as well. But I'm going to have to go and reread the literature. Thank you for asking such a stimulating question.
How many of those corals can get eaten by those sea stars? What were those other
Lots.
sea stars?
Crown of thorns sea stars. Oh, you picked up on a very small detail. Very good. So they can decimate entire reefs. So in Australia, they've actually developed culling methods. Do you know what culling is? Where you go out and kill organisms. But crown of thorns are actually natural. They're not an unnatural part of coral reefs. So these boom and bust cycles of them eating lots of corals and then dying back because there's no food left, that's quite normal. So it's, again, one of these debatable practices. Should we control these starfishes, or should we just let them go and eat 80% of coral on a reef?
Good question.
Is there any concerns about microplastics and coral reefs?
Yes, there's a lot of research on microplastics these days. It's, again, another debatable space, altogether bad. A lot of organisms digest and ingest microplastics, and a lot of folks have asked me when I dissect all these fishes, am I also looking for microplastics? And I did not particularly look for that, but I did see in a fair number of fishes microplastics. And this is on a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There is a human population there, but microplastics are everywhere. So I think they are probably having a big impact on these fishes, but again, it's one of these new fields that we're still learning about. And a lot of chemists are doing really cool work to understand the chemical impacts of microplastics on fishes and corals.
Hi. Are any of the coral restoration efforts trying to seed new reefs in higher latitudes to account for warming ocean temperatures?
Yes, so I mean, a lot of these coral restoration efforts are even focusing on just lab cultivation of the corals, and then reseeding in new places or in different places. It's really all over the place, and it is taken off. If you saw all those dots on the map, it's hundreds of locations that these efforts are being undertaken. So that is absolutely part of it.
Were starfish introduced by humans, and if so, where were they introduced from? The ones that are eating all the coral.
Starfish, the crown of thorns starfish, they were not introduced by humans. They naturally occur on these reefs, and they're more abundant in certain places than others, and they just go through these big cycles of being really prevalent and then dying back when the corals decline.
Howdy, howdy. This is a two-parter. First, what decisions could we be making inland that would affect the coral reefs for the better? And then the second part of that, if you're inspiring people that live inland, what coral reef would you go visit or recommend people to go see to change their perspective?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to see a healthy coral reef or an unhealthy coral reef? Because both could be influential. Inland is just as important as living on the coast. I think reducing greenhouse gas emissions is really the number one thing that we should be focusing at the moment. In our households, gas stoves aren't a great thing to have. They do leak. So thinking about that, there are lots of different solutions and suggestions out there. There's some great books about that to read. There's a project called Project Markdown that really delineates some climate solutions for individuals. So I would suggest looking into that project. As for coral reefs to visit, if you want something really close by, the flower gardens is a great option, but it is quite difficult to get out there. It takes several days on a boat, so you have to do an overnight boat trip. So not good for people who get seasick. But if you want to see something a little bit more tropical, I would suggest, if you want to see something pristine-ish, I would suggest going somewhere like Belize, where it still has elkhorn coral sands. Or something that's in really good shape in the Caribbean would be a place like Bonaire. They have really nice coral reefs there. If you want to see something a little bit more degraded, some reefs in Jamaica aren't doing so well. That's one of the longest studied coral reef systems in Jamaica that people have documented very clear declines. Also, the Bahamas is struggling right now. So some places that are relatively close to us.
Yes, sir.
So you said that some of the higher latitude coral reefs, they're I guess you could say more heat resistant because it's a lot hotter there. Could you technically breed the higher latitude coral reefs into those lower ones so they are more heat resistant, or would that be invasive?
So another really debatable question. It's a great suggestion. So people have thought about going to more extreme places where corals are surviving well. For instance, in the Gulf, in the Arabian/Persian Gulf, and trying to propagate those corals in other locations. But then you run into the problem of invasive species as well, right? Because usually when a certain coral lives in a certain part of the world, it doesn't in another part of the world. So we have to be careful not to introduce invasives, but some people say coral reefs are dying anyway. Maybe this is a good solution and we should give it a shot. So I can't tell you whether it's a good or a bad solution because we haven't seen the outcome yet, but it is something being considered.
All right, last question goes to you.
What human activity could affect the outbreaks of crown of thorns starfish?
Wow, people really like these crown of thorns starfish. You know, it's a natural cycle. It's not something really that's being induced by humans. These starfishes just sometimes become really prevalent because there's a lot of coral around. I will say if coral reefs die, so will the starfish, because that is their food. So if climate change continues and the reefs continue to heat, it's probably not going to be a good outcome for them as well.
All right, well, let's thank Dr. Casey once again for an awesome presentation.